December 7, 1941. The sky over Pearl Harbor burned with smoke and fire as Japanese aircraft unleashed one of the most infamous attacks in history. But as Japan celebrated its daring strike, American scientists and engineers were already working on a secret technology that would turn the tide of war. It was invisible, it was unstoppable, and the Japanese Navy had no idea it existed until it was too late. Welcome back to the channel, history fans. Today, we dive into one of the most overlooked yet game-changing aspects of World War II, American radar technology and how it completely stunned the Japanese military. This is a story of science, secrecy, and survival, a cat-and-mouse game fought not only with bullets and bombs, but with invisible waves traveling at the speed of light. To truly understand the shock the Japanese felt, we have to rewind to the late 1930s. Radar, short for radio, detection and ranging, was still a very young technology. Around the world, Britain, Germany, Japan, and the United States were all experimenting with radio waves to detect aircraft and ships. But when the war began, most nations saw radar as a curiosity, not as a war-winning weapon. In Japan, radar development lagged behind. Their navy placed more trust in their elite lookouts with extraordinary night vision, and their army favored aggressive offense rather than scientific investment. They believed sharp-eyed sailors and fast reconnaissance planes were enough to spot the enemy first. After all, Japan's navy was considered one of the most skilled in the world. But in America, things were different. By 1940, the U.S. had secretly begun building radar stations across the Pacific. In fact, on the morning of December 7th, just before the Pearl Harbor attack, two young radar operators, George Elliott and Joseph Lockard, detected a massive formation of aircraft heading toward Oahu. Sadly, their warning was ignored, dismissed as a flight of incoming B-17 bombers. This tragic oversight became a lesson that the U.S. would never forget. Radar could save lives, but only if people trusted it. After Pearl Harbor, radar research went into overdrive. The Americans poured millions into the development of better radar sets, not just for land, but for ships, submarines, and even aircraft. The centerpiece of this revolution was the -270 Seychelles rupees, and later the SG and SC shipboard radar systems, which could detect enemy ships and planes at incredible distances, even in darkness or fog. And here is where the story takes a dramatic turn. The Japanese Navy, masters of night attacks, suddenly found themselves being ambushed by American ships they could not see. Their carefully planned nighttime torpedo attacks began to fail. Their commanders couldn't understand how the Americans always seemed ready, as if they had eyes in the dark. In the words of Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison, a U.S. naval historian, radar did to night what the searchlight had done to darkness. It made it irrelevant. As we explore this story, you'll see how America's radar network became an invisible shield, changing the course of key battles like Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. And I'll learn just how shocked Japanese commanders were when they discovered what they were really up against. This is not just a tale of machines, it's a story of strategy, of soldiers who trusted science, and of enemies who learned too late that war had entered a new era. So grab your seat, because in this first part, we'll set the stage. The early war years, the race to develop radar, and the first hints that America was about to unleash a game-changing advantage. The early months of 1942 were dark for the United States. The Pacific was ablaze, the Philippines were under siege, Wake Island had fallen, and Japanese forces were sweeping through Southeast Asia, almost unchecked. But beneath the waves and beyond the visible horizon, something extraordinary was happening. American scientists and naval officers were quietly laying the foundation for a technological counterstrike. In Washington, D.C., a group of top-secret engineers, physicists, and mathematicians worked day and night under the newly created radiation laboratory at MIT, nicknamed the Rad Lab. Their mission? Improve radar to the point where it could guide American forces to victory. Many of these scientists were young, brilliant minds pulled from universities. They were told that failure was not an option. The survival of the fleet depended on them. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japanese commanders were still operating with pre-war doctrines. They relied on scout planes, lookouts with binoculars, and signals intelligence. They had some early radar prototypes, the Type 21 and Type 22 systems, but these were bulky, unreliable, and nowhere near as advanced as what the Allies were developing. In fact, the Japanese Navy largely underestimated radar, assuming it would play only a small supporting role in warfare. By mid-1942, the first real test of America's radar edge arrived, the Battle of the Coral Sea. For the first time in history, two fleets fought each other without ever seeing one another, a battle decided almost entirely by aircraft. Radar-equipped ships like the USS Yorktown and USS Lexington were able to detect incoming Japanese airstrikes earlier, giving their fighters precious minutes to get airborne. Though the battle was costly, it stopped Japan's advance toward Port Moresby. But the real showcase for radar would come just 1 month later, the Battle of Midway. On June 4, 1942, American radar operators detected waves of Japanese bombers approaching the island. This allowed Marine fighters to scramble and meet the attackers head-on, blunting what could have been a devastating strike. Even more crucially, radar aboard American carriers provided an early warning net that helped Admiral Nimitz position his forces for the decisive ambush that sank 4 Japanese carriers. Imagine the shock on the Japanese side. They had struck Pearl Harbor with near-perfect surprise just 6 months earlier. Now, suddenly, the Americans seemed to know exactly where they were and when they were coming. Japanese pilots returning from their missions were baffled. How had the enemy been so ready? And this was just the beginning. After Midway, the U.S. Navy doubled down on radar production. By late 1942, nearly every major American warship, from battleships to destroyers, was equipped with radar sets capable of tracking planes and ships dozens of miles away. A new generation of officers, trained in radar plotting and fighter direction, learned how to translate those green blips on a cathode ray tube into tactical advantages. On the Japanese side, however, complacency remained. Many officers dismissed America's growing radar advantage as coincidence or luck. Others believed that their superior tactics, especially their famous night torpedo attacks using the deadly Long Lance torpedo, would still overwhelm any technological edge. But in the dense, dark waters around Guadalcanal in late 1942, the Japanese were in for a rude awakening. The naval battle of Guadalcanal would become one of the first true radar duels of the Pacific War. American cruisers and destroyers, guided by SG radar, were able to open fire in pitch-black darkness, sometimes hitting Japanese ships before they even knew they were under attack. The Japanese sailors were stunned. For centuries, night combat had favored the side with better lookouts and more daring captains. Now, with radar, the Americans could turn night into day, stripping Japan of one of its greatest advantages. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, reportedly remarked after one such engagement that America's ability to strike accurately in total darkness was deeply disturbing and unlike anything we have faced before. The stage was now set for a technological arms race that would dominate the rest of the Pacific War, one in which radar would become just as important as planes, ships, and guns. By early 1943, radar was no longer just a supporting tool. It had become the secret weapon of the U.S. Navy. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the brutal series of night battles that raged across the Solomon Islands. The Japanese had entered these waters confident. Their destroyer crews were the best in the world at night fighting. Their Tokyo Express supply runs and night torpedo ambushes had terrorized American forces early in the campaign. But with the deployment of SG radar, the balance of power shifted. Picture this: a pitch-black night, clouds hanging low, the sea eerily calm. Japanese destroyers cut through the waves, preparing another surprise attack. They believe they are unseen, unstoppable. And yet, 20 miles away, on the USS Helena, radar operators are already tracking their every move. Within minutes, the American commander has plotted their course, calculated the perfect intercept, and ordered his ships to open fire, all without ever laying eyes on the enemy. When the first salvo crashes down on the lead Japanese destroyer, the effect is devastating. Shells find their mark with uncanny accuracy. Japanese captains are caught completely off guard. They don't even know where to aim their guns because they can't see their attackers. By the time they spot the muzzle flashes, it's too late. Several ships are already ablaze. This happened again and again during the Guadalcanal campaign. Battles like Tassafaronga, Kula Gulf, and Kalimbangara became laboratories for radar tactics. The Americans learned how to coordinate their gunfire using radar ranges, how to vector night fighters onto incoming enemy bombers, and how to track Japanese ships even through smoke screens. The Japanese response was one of disbelief and frustration. Some officers initially refused to believe that radar could be so accurate, attributing American successes to sheer luck or spies tipping off the U.S. Navy. Others began to suspect a technological breakthrough, but by the time Japanese engineers tried to accelerate their radar program, they were already months, even years behind. And radar was no longer just on ships. The U.S. had begun installing airborne radar on patrol planes like the PB-Y Catalina and the Avenger torpedo bomber. This meant Japanese supply convoys, previously able to slip through at night, were now being hunted from the sky. Perhaps the most shocking development for the Japanese came in late 1943 with the introduction of fire control radar. These new systems could not only detect a target, but also automatically calculate the precise aiming solution for a ship as guns. Suddenly, American warships were scoring first-round hits at night, in bad weather, and even in heavy seas, something that would have been nearly impossible before. One Japanese officer, after surviving a radar-directed bombardment, reportedly said, "It was as if the Americans could see through the darkness itself. We were fighting blind, while they fought with the eyes of gods." This growing disparity began to crush Japanese morale. What had once been their greatest strength, night fighting, was now a nightmare. Crews went into battle knowing that the enemy could see them long before they could see the enemy. The psychological impact was enormous. At the same time, radar played a crucial defensive role. In 1944, as Japan's air power grew desperate, waves of kamikaze attacks began targeting the U.S. fleet. Without radar, these suicide planes would have caused catastrophic losses. But thanks to radar picket destroyers stationed miles ahead of the fleet, the Americans had early warning. Fighter directors used radar plots to scramble combat air patrols, intercepting kamikazes before they reached the carriers. This radar umbrella saved countless ships and lives, though it came at a heavy price for the picket ships themselves, which bore the brunt of kamikaze attacks. By mid-1944, the Japanese High Command finally realized the scale of America's radar advantage, but it was too late. The U.S. had mastered radar-directed carrier strikes, night fighter operations, and amphibious landings guided entirely by radar navigation. And the next major battle, the Philippine Sea, sometimes called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, would show just how deadly this invisible technology had become. The summer of 1944 marked a turning point, not just in the Pacific War, but in the history of naval combat itself. The Americans were now fully armed with radar technology, not just on every major ship, but in the air, on submarines, and even in portable units carried ashore by Marines. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would be the ultimate test. Japan's plan, Operation Go, aimed to deliver a crushing blow to the U.S. fleet and halt the American advance toward the Marianas. They threw everything they had into the fight, over 400 carrier-based aircraft, the cream of their remaining pilots. But the Americans had something the Japanese didn't: a complete radar-controlled early warning system. As soon as Japanese planes were launched hundreds of miles away, radar screens aboard U.S. carriers lit up with ghostly blips. Fighter directors calmly vectored Hellcat squadrons to intercept at the perfect altitude and angle. The result was devastating. In wave after wave, Japanese aircraft were slaughtered before they could even see the American fleet. Pilots described the eerie efficiency of the radar-controlled intercepts. It felt less like a chaotic dogfight and more like an execution. One U.S. pilot famously quipped, "It was just like a turkey shoot back home," giving the battle its grim nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For the Japanese, this was more than just a defeat. It was a nightmare. Not only had they lost most of their remaining carrier air groups, but they were also forced to confront a chilling reality. The Americans could track them almost anywhere, day or night. Japanese carrier commanders had relied on surprise and timing, but radar stripped them of both. And radar wasn't just protecting the fleet, it was guiding the offense. The new Combat Information Centers, SEACs, aboard American carriers and battleships became the brains of the fleet. These dark, windowless rooms were manned by officers who translated radar data into real-time battle plans, vectoring aircraft, plotting enemy ship movements, and coordinating gunnery. This level of coordination was something the Japanese simply couldn't match. Their ships often fought as isolated units, while the Americans fought as one interconnected organism, a networked war machine decades ahead of its time. The turning point came at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. Here, radar's full power was unleashed. In the Battle of Surigao Strait, U.S. battleships, many of them survivors of Pearl Harbor, used radar fire control to cross the Japanese southern force. In pitch darkness, they annihilated the enemy with surgical precision. American gunnery officers, eyes glued to their radar scopes, calling out firing solutions as if they were conducting target practice, while Japanese ships sailed blindly into the trap. When the sun rose, most of the Japanese force lay at the bottom of the strait. Even more dramatic was the role radar played in defending the landing forces at Leyte from relentless Japanese air attacks. Radar-directed fighter patrols and anti-aircraft guns formed a near-impenetrable shield. While some kamikazes did break through, many were destroyed miles from their targets, thanks to the early warning system. Japanese survivors were left shaken. In their after-action reports, many described the Americans as possessing a sixth sense, able to detect attacks long before they became visible. One pilot wrote bitterly that it felt like fighting against an enemy with invisible eyes. By this stage of the war, Japanese engineers had finally managed to field more capable radar sets, and they installed them on some ships and shore bases. But the gap was too wide to close. Their radars were less reliable, and they lacked the sophisticated training and command infrastructure that made American radar so effective. The invisible war had been decided. Radar had shifted the balance of power so completely that even Japanese admirals admitted privately that further, large-scale naval engagements were hopeless. But as we'll see in the climax of this story, radar's most dramatic moments were still to come. In the deadly closing months of the Pacific War, when kamikaze waves, typhoons, and the final push toward Japan tested America's invisible shield like never before. By early 1945, the Pacific War had entered its most desperate phase. Japan was cornered, its fleet shattered, its air power crippled, but Tokyo was not ready to surrender. Instead, they turned to a new, terrifying weapon, the kamikaze. These suicide missions were designed to break American morale and sink carriers at any cost. And in the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa, radar would be pushed to its absolute limits. The U.S. Navy responded with one of the most daring defensive systems of the war, the radar picket line. Small destroyers and destroyer escorts were stationed miles ahead of the main fleet, their radars sweeping the skies for incoming raids. As soon as a blip appeared, the picket ships sent frantic warnings back to the carrier task forces, giving fighter directors just enough time to launch combat air patrols and intercept the attackers. But serving on the radar picket line was practically a death sentence. Japanese kamikaze pilots quickly realized that these lonely destroyers were the first line of defense, and they began targeting them relentlessly. Ship after ship was struck in horrific suicide crashes. Yet their crews stayed at their posts, calling out radar warnings even as burning wreckage rained down around them. One U.S. Navy officer later said, "The radar pickets were our early warning angels. They bought us time with their own lives." Thanks to this network, the Americans were able to blunt the worst kamikaze waves. Though losses were heavy, hundreds of ships were damaged or sunk, the core of the fleet survived. Radar had once again saved the carriers that were the spearhead of the Pacific advance. Radar wasn't just saving lives, it was guiding the final offensives. During the firebombing of Tokyo and the atomic bomb missions to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, B-29 bombers used radar navigation to find their targets through cloud cover. Even when weather or darkness obscured the cities below, radar ensured that the bombers could still hit with deadly accuracy. By the summer of 1945, Japan's ability to resist was nearly gone. The Imperial Navy had been reduced to a handful of ships, and even those rarely left port for fear of radar-guided American attacks. The once proud Japanese fleet was now powerless against a U.S. Navy that could see them coming long before they could strike. When Japan finally surrendered on August 15, 1945, it wasn't just because of the atomic bombs. It was because their military machine had been systematically dismantled. Radar was one of the invisible weapons that had made it possible. We never truly understood radar until it was too late. It was as if you had stripped us of our ability to fight at night, while giving yourselves the ability to fight without fear. The resolution of this story is clear. Radar had changed warfare forever. The Americans had not only caught up to the Japanese in the Pacific, they had surpassed them in a way that technology alone could explain. But the story isn't over yet, because what came after the war might surprise you. The lessons of radar would shape the Cold War, air defense systems, and even the space race. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the war in the Pacific had left behind not just a trail of devastation, but also a revolution in military science. Radar, once an obscure laboratory experiment, had proven itself as one of the most decisive factors in victory. In the aftermath, Japan's naval officers were given the chance to tour captured U.S. radar stations and even visit American ships. What they saw shocked them all over again. Complex arrays of radar dishes, combat information centers with glowing screens and plotting boards, and fire control computers that worked hand in hand with radar operators. This was not the Navy they had fought against. This was something entirely new, an integrated system of war. Some Japanese engineers openly admitted that had they known the full extent of American radar capabilities earlier in the war, they would have developed countermeasures much sooner. In fact, a surprising twist emerged after the war. Japan did have the knowledge to build better radar. Several research teams had been experimenting with cavity magnetron technology, the same breakthrough that gave Allied radars their power. But due to bureaucratic infighting and a belief that traditional tactics were enough, those programs never received the priority they needed. Meanwhile, the Americans took the lessons of radar and went even further. Radar became the foundation of air defense networks during the Cold War. Early warning systems like the Distant Early Warning Line in the Arctic were direct descendants of the radar stations that had once protected Midway and Guadalcanal. Even space exploration benefited. The same radar technology that spotted Japanese planes would eventually be used to track satellites, map planets, and guide spacecraft across millions of miles. The invisible waves that had once decided life and death at sea now became tools of discovery. For the sailors who fought with radar, however, its memory remained deeply personal. Many veterans described the eerie glow of the radar screen as the eyes of the fleet. To them, radar wasn't just a machine. It was a guardian angel that watched over them through the longest nights of the war. A technology born from fear, the fear of surprise attack, became the very thing that gave the Allies confidence to strike back and win. So the next time you see a spinning radar dish at an airport or a weather station, remember that technology has its roots in a time when the world was at war, when entire battles were fought and won by the ghostly sweep of a radar beam across a screen. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of World War II, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss our next documentary-style episode. The past is full of stories like this, stories of courage, innovation, and the moments that changed history forever. And now, I'd love to hear from you. Which World War II technology do you think had the biggest impact? Radar, the atomic bomb, or code breaking? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's get the discussion going. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep exploring history's greatest secrets.